Thank you very much, Steve. I am a great lover of this wonderful institution, the National Constitution Center. Also wanted to remind you that we have an exhibit upstairs in Posterity Hall between Signers Hall and the main exhibit area on Lincoln that I hope you'll get to take a look at sometime in the coming weeks. It's obligatory for a person sitting in this chair to praise the author and to praise his book. And ethically, I think anyone who agrees to perform my role as interlocutor have to genuinely believe that. And the other occasions in which I've done this, I have done this. But this really is an occasion in which I want to go a little bit over the top, because I do think Adam is a very special historian, and this is a very, very special book. As Steve described Adam's career, he really has been, at a remarkably early age, a very important public intellectual, speaking to a wide audience about a wide variety of subjects since he graduated from Harvard not that long ago. And now he has undertaken, it's hard to believe that this, and by the way, I have a really ratty copy of the book in my hand, because this is the publisher's bound galley proofs.
And that's what an author likes to see, a really ragged copy.
Yeah, but it's dog-eared, so I think I read it.
I hope you read it, Rick.
But this is a very, very important book, and it's a first book. He's done a lot of writing before at this time, but this is the kind of book that you would expect from a scholar who had written 5 or 6 or 7 such books. It really does give a remarkable picture of this first year leading up to and finally coming about in the Civil War. Adam has this style in which he makes very important general points about the American nation and about the coming of the Civil War, but he does so by just telling some absolutely compelling anecdotes about individuals, many of whom you'll be familiar with, but many of whom you will not until after you've read Adam's book. So I must say, this is somewhat shameless, buy this book. Okay, so I'm going to get to business now, Adam. Adam's been a very busy man in the past couple of days with all sorts of public appearances. Maybe some of you saw the interview with him in the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross yesterday. He was on Marty Moskowayne's Radio Times this morning. And, of course, as Steve Frank mentioned, yesterday was the 150th anniversary of the firing on Fort Sumter. Today's the anniversary of the surrender at Fort Sumter. And we will eventually get to those moments, because I know Adam wants to get to those moments. But I want to begin sort of at the beginning of Adam's book by asking about December of 1860. Abraham Lincoln has been elected a president. I think it's fair to say that a few Southern politicians are pretty grumpy about this outcome. I'd say a few South Carolinians are more than grumpy about the outcome. They're enraged by the outcome. And you introduce us to a relatively unknown, at least to me, an unheralded man, Major Robert Anderson, who has just been given command of the federal garrison at Fort Moultrie, also in Charleston Harbor. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those events in December of 1860, and in particular, help us understand what's going on in Anderson's mind as he's given a command of what might be a hopeless task.
Yeah, well, one thing I do want to thank you, Rick, for your introduction, and also especially the part about being young. I've gotten this a couple of times in the past couple of weeks, and I've just sort of thought, well, only in the context of Civil War historians does someone who's 40 years old get to be called this sort of kid all the time. And anyway, I like it. Anyhow, I'm glad you brought up this character of Robert Anderson, because he's one of my favorite characters in the book. And he's the first hero of the Union cause. largely forgotten today, I think, by most people, except for the real sort of Civil War nuts. And he's fascinating to me because he's a very reluctant hero. He's a sort of an accidental hero, which to me is the most interesting kind. He's a Southerner. He's from Kentucky. He comes from a slaveholding background, and in fact, his wife was the daughter of a very wealthy planter, and they had made a lot of money, terribly enough, by selling off the slaves that she had inherited. And he's a career officer in the U.S. Army who finds himself stationed at this sort of sleepy little post in Charleston Harbor. It was really a kind of a cushy Army post before the Civil War, where they sent officers who were seasoned to sort of while away their time, going to barbecues with the Charlestonians. And very quickly, however, he's at the center of an unfolding national crisis. In fact, it's already unfolding when he arrives. The southern states begin to secede, of course, in December of 1860, a month or so after Lincoln's election as president. And this little island, Fort Sumter, in the center of Charleston Harbor, becomes an isolated Union outpost. I think you want me to talk about before they get to Fort Sumter, however. So Anderson is originally stationed with his men at a place called Fort Moultrie, which is an old fort. It's a fort that goes back to the American Revolution. Anderson's father was a soldier in the Revolutionary War who had been stationed at this fort in the 1770s, 1780s during the Revolution. And he's got this little garrison there. It's 60 men and a brass band. Okay, that's this sort of military force that ends up being the bane of the entire Confederate States of America. 60 guys and a brass band, and some workmen. And they quickly realize that they're at the center of this unfolding secession crisis. South Carolina is sort of the center of this white-hot secession fever, and Charleston is the center of that. And the Southern militia begins encircling this little fort. And Anderson and his men realize that this fort is about as defensible, should it come to that, as a public park. And they're looking out at these troops that are massing all around them. They feel, as Anderson writes in a letter, he feels like a sheep tied up watching the butcher sharpen his knife. Not a very pleasant image. And so he does something very bold. He ignores his orders from the War Department, or more his sort of lack of definitive orders. And by night, under cover of darkness, he and his men cross in their boats to Fort Sumter, a more defensible position in the center of Charleston Harbor. And this is seen throughout the South as an act of war. It's interesting, when we talk about the beginning of the Civil War today, the story tends to begin with this Southern shot being fired at Fort Sumter. It's a very dramatic moment. It's a very important moment in American history. But for many people in 1860, 1861, this conflict began more when Robert Anderson and his men crossed Charleston Harbor and raised their flag above Fort Sumter. The South Carolina newspaper headlines scream out, by this act, Major Anderson has inaugurated a war, a civil war in our country. So that's where I start the book, this sort of night escape. We're right there at the fort as the boats are slipping away from the beach and crossing over, and Major Anderson has the American flag tucked under his arm that he will raise on the new fort.
Thank you, and it's just one example of Adams' techniques. He takes a person who we don't know much about, who was not a conscious hero in this struggle, but committed some quite extraordinary acts to set the
he was
whole
also
play into motion.
He was very ambivalent, and I like that about him. He was seen in the army as being this sort of gray bureaucrat. I mean, he was literally this sort of very gray-looking man, very serious and sort of dour, and he was mostly known in the army for having translated certain French artillery textbooks into English and being sort of everybody's